All right, all you APUSH people. So the next stop on our Grand APUSH timeline is going to be the Civil War. And so as a reminder, I've backed up 3 screens here, or I should say 3 videos here, to this screen that we were showing you the events of the antebellum period with, before we took those little diversions out into the Market Revolution and the Manifest Destiny videos. So we did already walk through a lot of these events that led up to this tension that would lead to the Civil War. We talk a little bit about the Compromise of 1850, which you should know where it fits on a timeline if it's 1850. Well, that leads to things like the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which leads to Bleeding Kansas, which leads to John Brown, and stuff like that. You've got the Dred Scott decision, which leads to abolitionists being so mad and pro-slavery people being so, see, the Constitution says you can't touch us, that this is only going to get solved by something big. And so when the election of 1860 comes along, again, you should know where 1860 belongs. Well, it is actually Lincoln's election that causes those first southern states to secede. And so down in South Carolina, they're the first place where they try to test these waters by trying to take this place called Fort Sumter. And so the first shots fired of the Civil War are considered Fort Sumter. We already talked about that as the ending period of this antebellum. So that shouldn't surprise you too much that the opening event of the Civil War we're going to count as Fort Sumter. We kind of carefully say the first shots fired in the Civil War. It's not really the first battle. The first battle is called Bull Run, but at that point you've got to remember what we say about wars in APUSH. War buffs in APUSH tend to hate wars in APUSH because we don't really go into the nitty-gritty of the battles and stuff. So there's not going to be much of that on this particular timeline. So if we just say beginning of the war was the first shots fired, the end of the war isn't exactly the last shots fired. After the surrender at Appomattox, there's still going to be some scattered fighting in some places around the South. But Appomattox is where Robert E. Lee has to surrender most of his Army of Northern Virginia to General Grant. And there's a lot of art and a lot of story that revolves around this surrender of the one general to the other general at Appomattox that is usually considered, traditionally considered, the end of the Civil War. So, what do you actually need to know about the Civil War on the timeline? I think to answer that, it would help to start to think about this line that we usually have as the passage of time through our chronology. Let's continue to think about it that way, but at the same time, let's just think about it as an oversimplified boundary between the North and the South. I'm not trying to imply that the actual border between the northern states and the Confederate states was a nice straight line. It wasn't, but it can actually help us kind of visually represent the idea that, well, most of the fighting happens down south. Because if you're the South, you just have to not lose. It makes the North come onto your territory to get you under control. And so there's 2 times in the Civil War where the South actually goes on the offensive and invades into northern territory. The first of those times, where Lee takes his army into the Union, he gets turned around at a place called Antietam. And so once he gets turned around at Antietam and has to go back down into southern territory again, well, that's a big deal as far as the Civil War is concerned, not just because it's the first of 2 turnarounds of the Confederates. It's also because before Antietam, the North wasn't doing so well in this war. And Lincoln's looking for a big victory that shows the strength of the Union before he issues this idea that he and his advisors have had going around for a while called the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation is going to be issued and then a few months later take effect after the Battle of Antietam, because it's that victory that shows the Northern strength enough that Lincoln goes, okay, people won't look at this as an empty promise. I'm going to issue my Emancipation Proclamation. So he issues it in September of 1862. It takes effect on January 1st of 1863. And in 1863, we're going to see the second of the advances of Lee and his army, where they get even deeper into Northern territory. And he's going to be turned around at a battle called Gettysburg. And the Gettysburg Address shows the importance of this battle, the fact that it's the last offensive invasion of the North by the South, and now they have to go back into Southern territory, and all the rest of the fighting in the Civil War is all going to happen down here in the South. Well, that's why Gettysburg is a big enough deal to be here on our Civil War. So the last thing that we're going to bring in, the last big turning point that we have in the Civil War, is not really a battle. If you were going to try to identify a battle, maybe you could call it the Wilderness, but that's kind of a draw. Why get into battles when we don't need to get into battles? The big turning point is not a particular battle at all. It's when Ulysses S. Grant is given command of all Union armies. Grant had been fighting out in the West and achieving some pretty impressive victories, while the Union in the East was pretty much floundering and not being able to get anywhere. So when Lincoln recognizes, hey, wow, let's take this guy who's winning the victories in the West and let's bring him here to the East, that's the biggest turning point of the Civil War. And if you ask why, well, again, we got to get a little bit into warfare. I promise we won't go down this road too far. But generally speaking, most of the Civil War before 1864, when Grant takes over, is this old style, you could call it Napoleonic style of fighting. It's the very gentlemanly style of fighting, if you can call shooting at each other gentlemanly. It's done by the rules of warfare that, well, I make the analogy to fencing with. Like, you know, armies would fight each other until it started to get dark. And then when it started to get dark, okay, we're done fighting for today. And people would go to their camps and they would light the fires, and then they would get up the next day and start fighting again. Those of us who know about things like World War I and World War II, it's like they really did that. When you defeated an army and kind of got them on the run, oftentimes you would try to chase them to capture them, but at some given point you would go, yeah, okay, well, we're gonna, I mean, that would happen. And in particular, when you got to a point where it would be bad for your own side to continue fighting, you would go, well, I don't want to do that, and you would stop. So the North and the South fighting each other under these kinds of rules, we say is kind of like fencing, you know, that kind of thing. When Grant takes over, the rules of warfare change. It's much more like they call it mixed martial arts. Like there's something extra great about having rules where, like, boxing is still sort of like fencing, because when somebody gets down on the ground, you have to go back to your corner and they get 10 seconds to get back up. This new style of fighting that lets you sit on the person and wail on them, that's more Grant's style of fighting. The first night attacks in the Civil War are going to happen during this period. The first times when Grant gets to be called, well, some of the first times when Grant gets to be called the Butcher, and that's not by the enemy, that's by his own men, because he just kept throwing Northern soldiers into the fight. Even when they were dying by the scores, he kept sending them, and he kept sending them, and he kept sending them. And it's this change in the style of fighting that finally makes the South get to the point where they're going to have to surrender at Appomattox. These are pretty much the three things you should know about the Civil War. The first turnaround of the South at Antietam, the second turnaround of the South at Gettysburg, and the fact that this could keep on going unless the style of fighting changes like Grant changed it, where he was going to keep going and going and going until they won. And they did.